Hello there, and welcome to the channel. Today we will be talking about the 2024 Toyota Tacoma. As you may know, Toyota has unveiled the 2024 Tacoma. It's actually been a couple months, and there's a lot of info out about them, but I figured I would talk about them and give kind of my own insight on them. And without further ado, here is the 2024 Toyota Tacoma. As you can see, it does actually have totally revised styling compared to the third gen. So this is actually a true total refresh. And it's also, to a certain extent, some new architecture. It is sharing some chassis design with the Tundra. Actually, not just the design of it, but the actual parts and everything. It's Toyota's goals with these two trucks was for them to be more universal with each other, to share more parts, to save on costs, um, which I may go into historically why that makes sense a little bit later. But for now, what you need to know is this is a new frame. It is still body on frame as it has been, but the chassis is, like I said, it is new and it is being shared with the Tundra. It's basically just different lengths, but for the most part, the parts are the same, and the styling of it is totally new, both inside and out. It is a brand new Toyota Tacoma, as well as the powertrain. The powertrain is also new in that this is the first generation Tacoma that is going to be a turbocharged inline four-cylinder, just with different tuning and different power options depending on what you're going for. But it's all the same engine. It's all the same. It is, I believe, it's a 2.4 liter turbocharged four-cylinder, and again, like I said, it's just depending on the trim levels you get will determine the power output, and I will get into those a little bit later. But first, I figured, why don't we take a step back and look at the history of the Toyota Tacoma, starting with Generation 1. So in case you didn't know, starting in 1989, Toyota began development of what we know today as the Taco, or the Toyota Tacoma, and it was designed as a replacement truck for the Hilux in the North American market, and they released it in 1995. It was introduced, unveiled in February of 1995, and it hit the market in March of 1995. And it's been selling ever since as a smaller option compared to back at the time when it first came out. They had the T100, now it's the Tundra, but the Tacoma has stayed pretty much the same in terms of its purpose, its goal, what it's meant for. It has grown. There have been some things that have changed about it, such as the size and the power output, but for the most part, the goal of it has stayed the exact same. So, Generation 1, as you can see, for any of you watching today who maybe you're not as familiar with 90s model vehicles, it looks vastly different than the Tacomas that we see today in vast quantities. But even still, I think this is still a very recognizable design, as this is a Tacoma. Although it did, even back then, it shared design cues with the T100 and later on the Tundra. Because again, I think their goal has always been that the Tacoma is a baby Tundra in a certain sense. And it also may surprise some of you to find out the Toyota Tacoma has actually always had an inline four-cylinder engine as an option. It's just the most common option that we see with the Toyota Tacomas that get sold is the V6 option. But back when it was released, the inline four was they actually had two inline fours. They had a 2.4 liter and a 2.7 liter, and they had a 3.5 liter V6. But those two inline four cylinders made up actually more of the trim level range than the V6. Given the V6 was more of an option and it was relegated to some of the higher trim levels. But even still, every single generation has always had an inline four cylinder. The 2.4 liter made about 142 horsepower and 150 pound-feet of torque. And then the 2.7 made a little bit more, and the 3.5 liter V6 made a little bit more than that. Later on in the life of the first generation Tacoma, they did come out with a TRD, or Toyota Racing Development supercharger kit for the V6 that bumped power up to around 250 horsepower and 270 to 290 ish pound feet of torque. And that was their kind of souped up Tacoma at the time. But again, like I said, it's even still, it's always been the smaller truck. But they did, they've always had the SR, the SR5, the pre-runner, which now is referred to as the TRD pre-runner. And I believe they've had the sport and off-road since then. If not, they did come later. But yes, this is the first generation Tacoma and almost everything that it had. I'm not going to go into great detail on it, but without further ado, here is the second generation of Toyota Tacoma. This generation was the first major redesign of the visuals of it, but it didn't stray too terribly far from the Generation 1. But just enough to call it a full new generation. There was quite a few new goodies with it, slight size change, if I recall correctly, and also they dropped, I believe it was the 2.4 liter inline four, and also they revised the 2.7. So the 2.7 was actually a new engine. It's a different it's a different ID than the 2.7 of the first gen. So if you don't know, Toyota calls their stuff like 2ARFE, stuff like that. Like that's their nomenclature for a given engine. And so that the nomenclature for the 2.7 in the first generation versus the second generation is actually two completely different names. So it's a completely different. It is a separate engine. It was not used in the first generation, but it did carry over into the third. But second generation did keep the V6, this time bumping it up to a 4-liter V6 that made about 240 horsepower and 290 foot-pounds of torque, naturally aspirated, which is pretty good for a naturally aspirated engine. But yes, this is the second generation Toyota Tacoma. And on we go to third generation Tacoma, which is probably the most common Tacoma to see on the streets at the present moment. Again, this one maintained the option of that 2.7 liter inline four, and it is actually the same engine as the second generation, as mentioned before. It's the exact same Toyota nomenclature for the engine per their naming convention. But they changed out the V6 from a 4-liter to a 3.5-liter. And what that did was, with the way that engine is tuned, it actually makes more horsepower than Gen 2, but less torque. So it makes about 270 horsepower and about 260-ish foot-pounds of torque, somewhere in that range. But it's still punchy enough to carry the weight of the truck and move it around. But that is pretty much what most people, their ideal for a Tacoma is for it to have the V6, because you have the higher horsepower and torque that is desired, especially if you're off-roading, which this truck is very well known for, especially now, the third generation. There's plenty of different overlanding builds that you can do, as you can see here. There's plenty of different suspension kits and tires and rims and all sorts of things that you can put on your truck if you're getting into the Tacoma scene and you're wanting to do off-roading. It is a very capable off-roading truck. There have been tests of the crawl control on the Tacoma versus its contemporaries, and where they will bury it into the sand and then they'll see which one can crawl out. And turns out the Tacoma is actually one of the few, if not the only one, who, in that scenario of being buried, it can actually dig itself out. Very useful, but often I would hope, just as a side note, if you're off-roading, I would hope that you are not going alone. I would hope that you're going with friends and other people who can help you out, or you can help them out if anyone gets stuck. But just, for the peace of mind of knowing that if you ever did get buried up to your doors in sand, the Tacoma is capable of digging itself out, assuming you have the supporting mods, such as the tires to give you the grip necessary. But this, like I said, this is the ideal of Toyota Tacoma in the eyes of a lot of people today. And it's why I understand now as we move into fourth generation Tacoma, I understand why some people don't like that they got rid of the V6. It's totally understandable. However, I do think it should be acknowledged this 2.4 liter turbo four cylinder is actually quite capable, especially if you get into the iForce and iForce Max trim levels. So, and before I go into what the different trim levels are, the thing that just what you guys need to know about this engine is you have your base model, your iForce, and your iForce Max. And in the iForce, there is actually a division between whether you have the manual transmission hooked up or the automatic transmission hooked up. And that actually does affect how much power you're getting. So the base level is about 230 horsepower, 240, 250 foot-pounds of torque. This is reserved mainly to the base model trim, which is the SR. And then once you go up from there, it's most likely going to be the iForce Max, and this is where it has an inline electric motor with the drive shaft, and it helps bump your power. And this one has about 270 horsepower. So to actually get specific, if you have the manual transmission, it'll be 270 horsepower, 310 foot-pounds of torque. If you have the automatic transmission, it'll be 273 horsepower and 217 foot-pounds of torque. Not a huge difference, probably not going to be noticeable in any 0 to 60 tests, but it is there. I'm not entirely sure why. More than likely, it's the gearing of the two transmissions is different, and they had to adjust the power to match those two different transmissions. But again, that's just my guess at it. Now, the iForce Max, this is for your Trail Hunter, which is the brand new trim. I'll get into that in a second, and your TRD Pro. The iForce Max is pushing out over 300 horsepower and over 400 foot-pounds of torque. This is the most powerful engine that they have put in a Tacoma yet. Now, again, granted, I know a lot of it's still, but it's a 2.4 liter turbo four cylinder. Well, if I know anything about Toyota, they beat the ever-living crud out of these engines before they ever put them in a car. They make sure that they can go the mileage, and then they put them in the car. So I'm not entirely concerned that there are going to be reliability issues. If I may, again, for a second, talk on a side note, Toyota has been taking part in the 24-hour of Le Mans race for a number of years now, and they've been doing hybrid. They've been competing in the LMP1 class with a hybrid build of car. And if I recall correctly, I do believe that is a turbocharged engine. I will have to double check on that, and I'll put down in the comments below what I find. But it's not like Toyota is totally new to turbocharged engines. They have made some legendary turbocharged engines, the most famous of which is the 2JZ engine found in the Toyota Supra. And so I don't think there's any reason to believe that a turbocharged engine from Toyota is likely to be any less reliable than their naturally aspirated engines. Another good example is the new GR Corolla and the prior GR Yaris. That turbo 3-cylinder has actually proven to be a very reliable engine, and especially when increasing the boost and pushing higher horsepower, it continues to run flawlessly and without issue. So again, I don't think there's going to be any sort of reliability changes. If it's the sound, I totally understand. The thing when it comes to engine sound is it's totally a preference. Some people don't mind or even prefer turbo 4-cylinder sounds over a naturally aspirated V6. Some people prefer the natural V6. Some people prefer turbo V6. Some people prefer V8, and so on and so forth across all the different types of engines that are out there. But just in the terms of this new Tacoma, I personally believe, looking at the numbers for it and what they're going for, this is actually a very awesome way forward for the Tacoma, especially in an era where We're seeing just all sorts of vehicles are being swapped over to EV. It's nice to see Toyota at least maintaining the Tacoma and the Tundra as ICE engines as they have been since inception, especially given we're not at a point yet where they're being forced to change it. So it's nice to even still see at all that they're still doing it that way. And even with the manual transmission, I will say the manual transmission has been an option on pretty much every generation of Tacoma. It's just not a very common option to see, much like the inline fours on prior generations, especially third generation. Pretty much almost every third generation I can think of that I've ever seen has been the V6 automatic transmission. And I think that's just because that's what the most people want. But they did make it with an inline four and with a manual transmission. And the fact that they're keeping the manual transmission alive for the fourth generation, I think is really, really cool. Now, the trim levels for this, as mentioned before, you have your SR, your SR5, your TRD Pre-Runner, your TRD Sport, TRD Off-Road, TRD Off-Road 4x4. I think you even have TRD Sport 4x4. You have TRD Pro, which we've seen. So all these trim levels we've seen before. But there's a new one called Trail Hunter. Now, I actually have a little bit of insight on this, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm not exactly sure what I'm actually allowed to say of my experience. But I do actually have some behind the scenes knowledge on the Trail Hunter and some bits and pieces on it. And what I will say is it's essentially think TRD Pro, but level of performance, TRD Pro level of performance, but instead of going fast off-road, this is more for crawling, getting into those hard to reach places, that sort of stuff. It's kind of like the TRD Pro is, almost like the Raptor version of the Tacoma, and it's the beefed up version of a TRD Sport. And for the longest time, the highest off-roading, like the slow crawling, climbing stuff kind of Tacoma there was, the highest trim level you could get was the off-road 4x4. The Trail Hunter is essentially putting more goodies onto an off-road 4x4, much like the Pro adds on goodies to a TRD Sport, but also with different nomenclature, this time with the brand new name of Trail Hunter. And as you can see, I'll put some photos up. It comes with a snorkel on it built, and I can say that this is actually put on at the factory. This is the first time that they're doing it that way. All prior ones, it was installed at the dealership when it got there, but this one is installed at the factory. And it's there again. Like, I don't know how much I can go into some nitty gritty details on that intake, but and no, I didn't actually work for Toyota. It was a separate company, but it's that what they're going for is, because if you're an off-road guy, having a snorkel is nice, so you can, kind of fjord like through some water, wade through some water without issues, without having to worry about, water getting into your intake and that sort of stuff. And even for the TRD Pro, the intake on that is actually made by the same company that I worked for. And I will say, like, at the very least, I worked on prototypes for both of those intakes. So I can tell you that stuff was being worked on probably a year or more before this was even unveiled. And again, as another side note, this is why if you remember back to my Camry video, I was talking about, I hope that they have a GR Camry in the works. And I didn't say that I hope they do it in the future, because of my experience with this program and the knowledge that if right now the 2025 Camry was just unveiled a couple weeks ago. It was unveiled like a week or two before that video that I made. So if they are going to come out with a GR Camry at any point ever, it is something that has already been in the works for a year or more. So for anyone who's watching, if you've seen, other content creators who are like, I hope they do this, I hope they do that, just know they don't they don't have the insight of this. They don't. I don't think a lot of people understand that it takes a long time to develop these things and to get through, production needs and restrictions and hitting, certain targets and goals and things that is set by the company. It takes a long time to get through those things. But I will, again, though, I will say Toyota does make sure that whenever they have a deadline, they are hitting that deadline pretty darn close, unless something major happens and they have to do a huge tear up. But all in all, that's just, my insight into this program. It it's not like they can just swap out the engine for a V6. No, they were set on it was going to be a turbo 4-cylinder for a while, and the intakes that you're seeing, it took months, if not a year, to design those and buy all the tooling to make them. And that's not something they're just going to toss out because their customer base wants a V6. They've already committed to it. They can't change off it. Unfortunately, it costs thousands of dollars just for the tooling, and then it's hundreds of dollars, per part or whatever the numbers are. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it's more to the order of like tens of thousands of dollars for the molds and everything to make the parts. And it's just they can't just change it on a whim. But I will say again, with these intakes, there was careful attention paid to making sure that the parts will come out in very good quality and they will last, and also at the same time that they're maintaining certain tolerances to other things in the engine bay. A lot of companies have a certain amount of distance that they need between parts in the engine bay, whether it's 10 millimeters, half an inch, a quarter of an inch, whatever it is. And for Toyota, they have a set distance that you have to maintain between parts. And I was there for a fair bit of the design process on it, and that was all. It was done actually quite well, I will say. And there was a lot of attention paid to, making sure it comes out good. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say on the 2024 Tacoma. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was informative. And, I put a lot of effort into making sure I'm giving good information and that it's not flat out false. So if you enjoy the content and you would like to continue to see more, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell so that you can keep up with all the content that I'm putting out. And I look forward to seeing you next time in my next video. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.